Few years ago, you were running service. People came to you with questions, you know where you stood, you know what you were good at, and then you left restaurants. Now you're sitting in meetings, taking notes, presenting slides, building assets, and wondering if you're actually any good at all. If that sounds familiar, this episode is for you. Most episodes of Fugitive Chefs start with a guest. Someone who left restaurants, someone who built a business, someone who found a completely different path through food. And those stories matter because they show what's possible. But every now and then, I do something slightly different. Instead of focusing on one person's journey, I want to focus on a pattern. Something that keeps showing up in podcast interviews, LinkedIn conversations, messages, and comments from people trying to build careers beyond traditional restaurant kitchens. And today's episode is about one of those patterns. Because over the last few years, I've watched a lot of talented chefs successfully make the transition into food companies, innovation teams, R&D departments, consultancies, startups, and corporate environments. And what surprised me wasn't that the transition was difficult. I expected that. What surprised me was how many capable chefs started doubting themselves once they got in. Not really before, but after. People who had spent years managing sections of a restaurant, departments in a kitchen, training younger chefs, leading teams, working under pressure in some of the best kitchens in the world, suddenly questioning whether they actually belonged to this new environment, whether they were smart enough, whether they had somehow overestimated themselves. A few days ago, I published an article on Substack called The Internship Trap. The article generated some interesting conversations, discussions, and a few comments that challenged parts of my thinking in a very useful way. But after reading all of those conversations, I realized that the article wasn't really about just internships. It was about recognition, or more specifically, what happens when chefs enter environments where their competence is no longer immediately visible. You're listening to Fugitive Chefs, a podcast about what happens when chefs step outside the traditional kitchen path. I'm Furkan, I've worked in kitchens like Noma and Mugaritz, and today I work outside restaurants, currently as Senior Innovation Chef at Kraft Heinz. And today I want to explore a question that I think affects more chefs than we realize. Why do so many chefs start doubting themselves after leaving restaurants? One of the comments I received on the article said something that perfectly captured this issue. The comment read, "A kitchen tells you the same night whether you were good. In a company, that signal can be quiet for months." And honestly, I think that sentence explains almost everything. Because kitchens and companies measure competence very differently. And once you understand that, a lot of the insecurity many chefs experience suddenly starts making a lot more sense. Let's get into it. Many chefs believe the hardest part of leaving restaurants is getting into the food industry in the first place. For years, the world outside kitchens can feel distant and opaque. But one thing kitchens are incredibly good at is feedback. Not always kind feedback, not always healthy feedback, but feedback. Service tells you immediately, the chef tells you immediately, your colleagues tell you immediately if something's going wrong. You know where you stand, you know where you are hierarchically in the kitchen, you know where you are at your skill set. And if you're improving, also people notice. If you're struggling, people notice at that as well. If you're carrying the team, even silently, everybody sort of knows in the kitchen. The signals in there are direct, and after years inside the environment, we become accustomed to that clarity. What I've also seen is that we sort of start using it to measure ourselves. We understand our value through action. Kitchens are more about showing what you are good at and getting and earning that responsibility, and that shows you where you stand in that team. And we also value repetition, we value service, we value excellence. And then many chefs move into companies, and suddenly this feedback loop that we have, not just from teammates, from colleagues, from your manager in the team, in this kitchen, your head chef or sous chef, whoever that is, but you also your guests who give you very immediate feedback. Once you move into the companies, this feedback loop disappears. Projects take months, promotions can take years, success becomes much harder to see. Sometimes you're doing excellent work and nobody says anything about it. Sometimes the people receiving recognition aren't the people doing the execution in most food companies. And many chefs, from what I've seen from all the conversations, not just on the podcast, but outside it, from people who have now moved into food companies, they interpret this silence very personally. They sort of get into thinking, maybe I'm not good enough, when often the reality is simply that this system which you're in now works very differently. one phrase that I used in my Substack article, and I'm going to post the article in the description, the link to it. I mentioned a collapse of professional framing, this phrase, because that's what I think many chefs experience. Inside a kitchen, you know who you are, you have status, you have a position, a job title, you have responsibility, you have expertise in that specific place that you're in, and people usually come to you for answers. And then you enter a company and suddenly you are the intern. For many people, the pathway to these food companies start with internship or as an associate, as a trainee, as a junior. You spend meetings taking notes, building slides, in fact, that you won't present, supporting projects, learning new language. And when I say new language, I mean the food language, but inside food companies, learning new systems. And none of the signals that used to prove your competence seem to matter anymore. You can manage a Saturday night for 250 covers, but now you're nervous speaking in a meeting with 6 people. Probably you can train a brigade because that's something you've done in restaurants, but now the same person in a food company is unsure how to present a recommendation to stakeholders or present the company in front of, say, supermarkets who they are pitching their products to, just to give you an example. The strange thing over here is your capability did not really disappear. The environment changed, the rules changed, the language changed, but many chefs start questioning themselves instead of questioning the system around them that they're new into, and maybe all they need is framing themselves into this environment with the capabilities they have. They feel lost because they're measuring themselves by metrics that they're not used to measuring themselves for. One of the most thoughtful comments I received pushed back on my article. The argument was basically that maybe internships aren't the trap. Maybe chefs genuinely need to learn consumer research, retail, innovation processes, product development, manufacturing, and all these realities that come with these jobs. Honestly, I think I agree. I think humility matters. I think learning matters. Nobody should expect to walk into the industry and automatically become senior within that environment. But that isn't really my argument through the article. My argument is something very different. The problem isn't starting low. The problem is staying categorized as temporary, entering these positions and entering this mindset of entering that company as an intern, where they don't even look at your skill sets because they clearly know what they want from you. And there is no real platform to show what you're capable of to possibly get hired in that same company, if that's the goal of many interns entering these food companies. Because once organization labels somebody as the intern, they often continue evaluating them as potential rather than the capability. And that's where things become dangerous. Because I believe that highly capable people, and as I've seen in the industry day in and day out, they can spend years inside the identities that no longer reflect what they can actually contribute. I think chefs need to understand something very important. The transition doesn't end when you get the internship. A lot of people listening to the podcast or outside it, people who just think that they don't want to be in restaurants anymore, they want to take their skill set to a different industry, they somehow believe that the end goal is to get that transition. And it can be in the face of an internship, maybe it is getting a temporary position, maybe it's being a contract worker inside this new environment. And honestly, they do open doors. I mean, maybe education is your option and that's what you think is going to solve everything. But I feel that the transition doesn't necessarily end when you get that internship, when you get that first job. In many ways, that's when the real work starts. Because now you have to learn how to make your expertise that comes from a different industry visible within this new environment. You have to learn a new language. You have to familiarize yourself with new systems. You have to understand how these new organizations recognize value. And that takes time. The mistake is assuming that temporary uncertainty means permanent inadequacy. They are not the same thing. The biggest lesson I've learned through this journey and while writing this article is this: experience only matters once institutions know how to recognize it. If you are having some sort of capability and the institution you're at isn't recognizing it or doesn't value it within their framework, there is no way you can translate it. Many chefs enter companies believing they've lost something, that they've become less capable, less valuable. They have to start from scratch. They have to compare themselves with their marketing peers, with their sales peers, with their sensory science peers, maybe the food technologists. But often that's not what's happening. What's happening is that they're operating inside a system that hasn't yet learned how to read them. And this is what I say, being inside a food company, speaking to the biggest food companies out there, the staff within them, the chefs within them, I feel there is a massive gap in understanding what chefs can bring to food companies, what chefs can bring to these different environments, not just food companies. I mean, right now I'm being very specific with my example, but to academia, to research, to working within a startup, to working in, say, some sort of food policy making, etc. I feel that chefs, yes, the craft is very connected to the job, so people connect chefs with cooking, that's correct. But I feel a lot of capabilities you learn, say managing a team, leading a team, coming up with dietaries on the fly, thinking on your feet, communication skills, thinking as a founder. Recently on the last episode, right, we had Leaf and he mentioned this correctly, that chefs are basically basically the best fit for founders, because they are day in and day out trying to impress their stakeholders, hold their values, or bring a team together and kind of make this whole team believe into a goal which is probably statistically impossible to reach, but it's a chef who leads these people and he or she gets this team driven to be able to reach something. So I think what's happening, what I'm seeing within massive organizations, is that they get chefs into food companies or food related businesses or careers because it's a very obvious connect, but their translation of capabilities, what they're getting the chefs in for, is very limited to the food itself. So in, say, let's say food policy, right? In food policy making, they have a chef and they just use the chef to translate the ideas they already have. So if they have a certain idea to popularize, let's say, Caribbean food in Europe, they will just use the chef to get the recipes, to possibly do some fancy catering for some delegates visiting, but they don't see beyond what chef can tell them about how the glossary of Caribbean food has to be within European context, what will be interpreted how to price something, or how to use collaborations with chefs to the network effect that I can have to popularize a cuisine, or how to think of the ingredients you can switch working in this context, or think of how dietary needs are changing within Europe and what Caribbean cuisine can supply for these dietary changes that are happening, or new legislations or problems with geopolitics what are happening. What could the Caribbean kind of supply to compensate for these troublesome geopolitics we have in the region right now? So this is me as a chef thinking on the fly. This is not scripted, this bit that I've just told you, but I feel this is where a lot of organizations are missing this translation layer of understanding where chefs should be in their innovation processes, in their companies. And that's why most chefs enter these places and they get somehow misframed, misjudged for their capabilities, and they start questioning themselves. I think the effort with this episode is to make you understand that it's not you. It's not you who is kind of the problem over here. I think it's about a system that doesn't really understand you yet. It's a system which is very open to, now I'm seeing more and more companies wanting chefs within them, but I feel they're still not prepared to rightfully use the skill set. So right now they're just kind of trying. Every company is trying their own methods and making their own mistakes. But I feel there is a lot of work to be done in this gap. And honestly, until more organizations learn how to recognize culinary talent beyond cooking itself, I think we'll continue seeing talented chefs underestimate themselves during these transitions. Not because they lack capability. I mean, if you're out there listening, it's not because chefs lack capabilities to work in these places, but because capability and recognition are not the same thing. If you've gone through this transition yourself, I would genuinely love to hear your experience. What surprised you most after leaving restaurants, and when did you finally start feeling competent again? I know there's a lot of people out there super experienced who listen to this podcast, and I would love to hear you. If you're on YouTube listening, then leave your comments. If you're on Spotify, you can leave your comments as well. Write to me on Instagram. Wherever this podcast reaches you, I would love to hear your opinion. And yes, podcasts are a very one-way medium, but if we can make it interactive, if we can kind of get your inputs in for the kind of guests I should bring on to kind of decode this for all of us who are in this, I think it's beneficial for all of us that industry and organizations who are hiring chefs today start understanding how can they use the capabilities chefs bring with them beyond just cooking the food itself. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to support the podcast, please like, follow, subscribe, rate, review, whichever platform you're on, which is Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever that is. Please give us your support. I feel the little button that you press to follow the podcast, to rate this episode or review this episode, it really helps the podcast reach more people, because I think it's not a very obvious niche that I'm speaking to. And it's only if people within the niche promote this and reach out to your colleagues who have these shared with you, I don't know, their own dissatisfaction with what a restaurant career provides. Maybe suggest them to listen to this episode or some other episode that you found interesting. And that would really help spread the word and help somebody else who has the same questions just like you. So thanks so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.